Good evening and welcome to Perspective. It's indisputable that Pakistan needed a comprehensive framework of laws regulating cyber activity. Problematic use of technology can range from playing a role in militancy or terrorism to crimes against individuals like data theft, blackmail, account hacking. Therefore, Cybercrime Bill is a welcome piece of legislation, particularly since the amendments have removed some of the hitches in the bill. Let's talk about how it aims to deal with cybercrime law. I have with me today YASIR Hamdani. He is a lawyer who has extensive research on the subject. ALEENA ALVI, who is also a lawyer who has expertise in international cyber security, and ASAD Beg from MMFT. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start with you, YASIR. Particularly, the preamble to the bill says that it specifies that it doesn't just deal with the substantive law, but also the procedural law. And doesn't that make it doesn't it make it a very broad piece of legislation?
Well, it certainly is a very broad piece of legislation in terms of how it approaches the issue. It has certainly tried to widen the ambit of its application. Unfortunately, the problems in the law themselves, the law itself is they still exist because despite what you said initially.
I'll just come back to what are some of the hitches that were there and how they've been removed in a bit. ALEENA, particularly since you are an expert in the international on the international side of things, how do we deal with it? How do we deal with cybercrime internationally? What kind of laws exist internationally? Just as
an international convention, there is no comprehensive international convention at the moment on cybercrime bill, and that is for the reason because it's very difficult to draft a piece of legislation that would deal with such sort of technology which keeps on developing with time and again. So one of the things that we have to see when we are drafting this legislation is the freedom of expression, which is basically comes under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we have ratified at the moment. The only piece of international convention that we have right now is the Budapest Convention, but it's a European convention. It's a regional convention rather than anything else, and we are not obviously a signatory to that.
ASAD, you know, like ALEENA is saying, it's an evolving law because it's an evolving subject. Every day there are new issues. So to tackle such a subject, of course, it's very difficult to make a piece of legislation that can, even to start off with, cater to a lot of situations. Isn't that true?
I completely agree with what you said initially and what my colleagues and friends were saying. But there's just one correction that I would like to make. There is usually this perception that the civil society, especially us, the people who are working or advocating for civil rights and internet rights in Pakistan, are against cybercrime legislation. But that's absolutely incorrect. We do realize that there is a very important sort of, it's an important piece of legislation. We need it. But we also need to make sure that it does not infringe any civil rights in Pakistan.
Right. So it has to be a balance.
Exactly. So that's our major concern, I would say.
Right. Yasir, what are some of the problems that as a lawyer you think that, just to a layman, what are some of the problems that people have encountered and will encounter as cyber law keeps evolving, new issues keep arising?
Well, first of all, any law is as good as the judges that are implementing it. So I think one of the most important things that has to happen under this law is that the judges have to be trained properly. And I think there's a provision which provides for the judges to be trained in cybercrime and cyber law. In terms of the law being required, yes, it was required because what you have is this new medium, this new vista, as it were, which challenges antediluvian notions of state and society. And so how do you go about actually controlling it or actually creating boundaries for it? That is paramount, before the legislators. I think one of the things that has to be understood, that has to be underscored, is the fact that Pakistan is a democratic state, and then there has to be that balance, as Asad was saying, between civil liberties and requirements which arise from misuse of technology. And I think that is where the law has to be cater in a way where it does not sort of go, there's no overreach on part of the executive. And I think the problem there would be in terms of certain definitions which are too broad, and that I think is the biggest problem with this law at this time.
Right. ALEENA, like Yasir is saying, that some of the definitions he feels are too broad within this law. Isn't it true that this law, in any case, any law, for example, would and a new kind of law, like he's also said, would be open to interpretation? So it would depend, and he's already said that the judges, it depends on the kind of judges and precedents and how they keep coming. How is it internationally taken? I mean, you said that there is no one particular law in one region.
I think a lot of that depends actually on the state practice, and one of the things that we need to recognize right now as well, that a lot of, unfortunately a lot of people right now also do not understand that there are different categories of cyber threats that exist, and people do not have knowledge of the different sorts of categories that exist right now. So for instance, when we are talking about the cybercrime bill right now, it's not just limited to cybercrime bill, because it has cyber security mentioned in it, it has cyber terrorism mentioned in it, it has cybercrime in it. So it's essentially 3 categories of cyber threats that you're talking about, which has been amalgamated in one piece of legislation. So obviously there is bound to be a lot of issues when it comes to interpretation as well. When the sort of I think example that we can take from other countries is the fact that so even in our case, our state basically takes the plea that we have adopted the Budapest Convention, or we are following the Budapest Convention. Now one of the issues with Budapest Convention is that it's really outdated. A lot of countries are not becoming signatory to it because of the fact, because the technology has developed so far that they think that there is a need for new legislation, or at times they are just they want state practice to basically function.
To very simply,
yeah.
Recently an example that, and we've talked about this in one of the previous programs, that there is the Facebook issue with regard to Kashmir. A lot of people saw that posts relating to Kashmir were removed by Facebook.
Yeah.
In a situation like this, if it pertains to a particular country or a particular region, for example, if in Pakistan we put up not on Facebook but generally about somebody, for example, and I'm just giving a scenario, how does this law then cater to that kind of a situation if it's inflammatory? Asad.
Thank you so much. I'll come to that in just 1 minute because I need to also mention that there were amendments made in this law, but civil society people who have been working on it for past like 2 years, they still have concerns over it. So I think it should be an ongoing process, and the government should not rush it.
But it will be an ongoing process anyway, because it's one of those subjects where new issues will crop up,
yes,
right?
But I'm speaking of the legislation particularly, right?
Right.
And so
you think amendments will anyway keep on coming?
I think before the bill is passed, it should be made sure that the amendments that civil society people, advocates who were present in the committee meetings and in the process basically, when this piece of legislation was actually made, they should be considered very seriously. And that means all 3 of us, we have been a part of this process, and we have individually and organizationally and in groups made specific recommendations to improve it, not to sort of dilute it or to make it less effective. So that's point number 1. Second point is, I think what you're saying is extremely important, and what I'll come back to what ALEENA was saying as well. Because you see, this legislation in its current form, it feels like a law which deals or tries to deal with a lot of things, including cyber terrorism and cybersecurity and so on, but it does not. And very simple example of that.
But under the law,
yes,
how does it deal with cyber terrorism particularly?
I'm coming to that. So very simple example would be, there is absolutely no mention of anything relating to terror financing anywhere in the law, right? So it's a very common perception that this law will also deal with, there is a separate section called cyber terrorism, but it doesn't really talk about terror financing, let's say, or the devices or the bombs which are detonated using sort of a technological mean, or internet maybe, or mobile phone, or a GSM network. So our concern is that, look, these are 3 different, very, very different issues. When you say cyber terrorism, when you say cybersecurity, when you say cybercrime, these are absolutely different sort of realms. You don't need to tackle them per se in one legislation. So that's
But when
yeah.
you, recently in India, for example, there were two posts, I think, by two people which were, they said were inflammatory. Their military felt they were inflammatory, and they were removed. That's a sort of censorship. But if somebody does that, for example, in Pakistan, how does the law propose to deal with that?
Yes. First of all, I would say India is a bad example because they're clearly lacking in human rights, and they are in some cases
I agree
way
completely,
below us.
and that was
Yes.
just as a scenario,
Yeah,
and
so
as an example.
When we say about taking content offline, that is very important, mind you.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of content which is actually inciting, directly inciting violence, let's say religiously speaking, or and various there are various cases, various scenarios, right? And no law in the world, and my lawyer friends are here, correct me if I'm wrong, no law in the world can actually allow direct incitement to violence, right? Be it on internet or in newspaper or in the television media or anywhere else, right? So that should be taken off. There is no discussion on it. Child pornography, for instance, right? These are the things that anywhere in the world, any country, any piece of legislation will not allow it. So what we are talking about is to actually take out the terms which are overbroad, which are open to interpretations from this law, right? So for instance, I'm just, again, I would leave the legal analysis to my lawyer friends, but there is this one term which says creating hatred. Now hatred, this term is nowhere literally defined in international law, because it's very difficult to define hatred because it's so broad, right? So when you keep things like that, when you have qualifiers like that to actually identify a criminal offense, that creates a lot of problems. And
right. Let me get Yasir's intake on that. Yasir, how problematic is it to have a term like Asad is saying, a term like hatred, when all around us there are clear examples of that?
There are clear examples. However, experience has shown in Pakistan that at times legitimate expression by minorities, for example, has also been criminalized. So we have to be very careful in terms of seeing what hatred is, and that is why the law has to be a straitjacket in this case, because this is dealing with a particular subject, and that subject is cybercrime and cyber law. Now there was some mention of Budapest Convention. With the Budapest Convention, I mean, obviously it's an outdated convention, but even on that minimum standard, if we were to place this law doesn't come up. For example, if we are going to talk about the Budapest Convention, it has certain particular crimes that have been mentioned in there. So we can add hatred in it as well, hatred against minorities or hatred against religious hatred based on sectarianism, etc. But what about the fact that you are actually empowering the government with this power to take off content online in the name of the glory of Islam, integrity, morality, etc. Now the problem with that is that is a subject that should not have been dealt through this law. So I think in terms of the overreach of the law with respect to certain definitions, I think
but
that's
it also talks about, I'll come back to you, ALEENA, it also talks about international cooperation. In what way does it talk about international cooperation?
I think for me personally, I think that was a really good clause that was incorporated in there, considering the fact that there is no international convention right now which actually deals with cyber crimes or cyber threats. That is the way to go right now. So when I keep on referring to state practice is through these sort of bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements that you have with other states, wherein you decide that, okay, so if for instance there is a perpetrator who is sitting in XYZ country and he is committing a crime there, whether we can share that sort of information as well or not. So I think that is the way to go forward as well, and that basically will define our state practice and the other country's state practice as well. Because one of the things again that we need to consider is the anonymous nature of the attacker as well. So if a person is for instance sitting in USA and attacking in Pakistan, do we have the expertise to track down that person or not? And even if we do, how do we get his information? How do we bring him? Can we prosecute him or not? Right. So international cooperation in that sense is going to give us a go ahead and make us. I think that's the way to go about it.
So
right
it's basically you will be able to share technology also.
I think that's more when it comes to confidence building measures as well, where you can go for trainings and you need the expertise as well, right? So right now, for the first thing, there is a mention of the emergency response team, I believe, in the legislation, but do we have that sort of expertise right now?
Right,
or not?
so it has
Right.
to be seen
So it
whether
has
we
to
have
be-
the technology
exactly,
or not.
exactly.
Asad, how would you say that the bill aims to counter ICT-driven crimes in the country?
I think there are a lot of good things in the cybercrimes legislation as well, and I'm being slightly modest when I say a lot of good things, but there are good things. So, for instance, it tends to deal with the child pornography very clearly, very concisely, right? So, this is one of those issues that we need to be able to deal with online in Pakistan, right? And I think it's extremely important. Then there is another concern of young female internet users who have probably just started using internet. They don't really have a lot of sense of digital safety, and so the privacy of their data that's extremely important. And you know, God forbid, when they fall in a situation where they really need help in terms of if somebody is blackmailing them, for instance, or something like that. So I think that should be the government should be able to deal with some of those issues under this law. But having said so, one of the concerns that I need to highlight here as well is that this law is generally, there is this feel around this law that it's made completely out of the purview of the previous legislation which have been made on the similar subjects, not cybercrimes per se, but dealing with the security and all that.
Right.
So there are a lot of offences in this law which are criminal offence straightforwardly.
Like child pornography anyway.
Yes, child pornography is understandable, but spamming, for instance, spamming is at best public nuisance, right? So, but that is sort of criminalized under this law. So, and also there are various things which I personally feel that are out of line from, if you compare them, for instance, say with the Fair Trial Act or the Pakistan Penal Code.
But you're criticizing it and saying that it is dealing with it is making things more. It should make things more public, right? But on the other hand, there's a provision in the law, from what I understand, that says that the user will be exposed, and in a lot of cases the user is somebody who's written an opinion or a blog or something and they don't want to be exposed. Isn't that the flip side then? If we're trying to expose people who are actually criminals, then how do we deal with that? I mean, these are two separate things, right? If you can clarify, Yasir.
Right, I think that's where the balance has to be struck.
Right.
Balance between the person who's the perpetrator and the user or legitimate user who's online. I think that is one of the concerns that are there for these, sort of this law in itself. How it plays out in reality is another question. I mean, are you going to have which agency, the investigation agency that they've spoken about, is it going to be an existing agency, or is it going to be an agency that is going to be set up from scratch, and will it be working with the existing cybercrimes cell of the FIA? So these are the kind of issues that come up which are of concern. Also with regards to spamming, I just want to add the
Yes.
definition there with the unsolicited. So if I send you an email, that is an unsolicited email. So that's what we're talking about in terms of there being a broad purview of these definitions, is that you have these definitions where, like, spamming, anything can become spamming. So my email to you can be construed as spamming and I can go to jail for it. So that's the kind of problem that you have to address.
ALEENA, isn't it true that even if this law tried to cater to everything that are the problems that a lot of people in the civil society feel, and a lot of, even if this law tried to cater to all those issues, there would still be issues, because it's the kind of subject that will evolve and new issues will arise?
Of course, there is no doubt about that, and I think with that as well, we'll have to constantly build our expertise in the field as well, because as you were talking initially as well, when it comes to you know, talking about or dealing with some sort of cyber threats. For instance, giving you an example of cyber terrorism. Now, in the European countries, they don't feel that cyber terrorism is an issue. But in Pakistan, for instance, we are facing cyber terrorism, and it is a very major big issue that needs to be tackled. So with time, things will change, and because of the sort of technology being developing at such a fast pace, there will be amendments nonetheless. And even when we talk about, you know, freedom of expression, which is one of the conventions that we have ratified, it is always subject to reasonable restrictions. So when Yasir is talking about, you know, a balance needs to be struck, the balance is there in the international convention as well. But what we have to see right now, whether the legislation is striking that balance right now as well or not.
Right.
Whether the government has too much autonomy to block content where it should not have. Right, so these are the things that need to be looked at.
Asad, purely moving a little away from the cybercrime bill towards cybercrime, purely as a social analyst also in your role, is that, don't you feel that the criminal world today and the kind of terrorism that the world is exposed to today, we really need more checks, we need more gateways, in every way possible. You know, around the world, we've seen in the last month how many attacks have happened. So what do you feel about that? I mean, of course, freedom of speech, of course, freedom of expression needs to be balanced. But even otherwise, terrorism is an issue that the world is facing for the first time, like it has never faced it before.
I completely agree with you, and I don't think there is any doubts in our mind, or my mind, let's just say that there needs to be an effective cyber crimes legislation which deals with crimes and criminals, you know, who are sort of, you know, committing them in a cyber world, and basically make our country a safer place, you know, and deal with other issues as well, which is terror financing, cyber terrorism, and it's a whole plethora of things, right? And that's extremely important. There is absolutely no discussion on that. But you see, this is the point. Now we have an opportunity, right now in this movement, we have this opportunity, the government of Pakistan have this opportunity to at least make one cyber crimes law which, let's say, not deals with everything under the sky, but at least certain issues that they've identified, right? So my concern now is, particularly speaking, freedom of expression is a big concern. Absolutely agree with that, and other civil liberties are huge concerns for me. But also one of the concern is that now that the government has opportunity, they should use it to the best of their resources, to the best of their abilities, right? So, and if, for instance, we use this opportunity to let the cyber criminals go and let the cyber terrorists go, but focus on the citizens of Pakistan, and you know, in a futile attempt, let's just say that, to sort of, you know, not letting go any political dissent, and you know, I'm just again saying stuff, but anyway, so that will be a big loss to us as a nation, as a country. That will be a big loss.
Right. And we'll take a short break, after which we come back and we talk more about the cybercrime law and cybercrime in the country, in the region, and in the world. Welcome back after the break. Yasir, the bill also talks about misuse of digital gadgets and unauthorized access to information. It does, in a lot of cases, plug loopholes that existed in the law, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and I think if you think we're being critical, it should be balanced out by the fact that the very fact that you have this bill today, or this law which is going to be passed is great progress over the past situations.
So what other loopholes do you think that it aims to
in terms
deal with?
In terms of dealing with the fact that there is cybercrime and cybercrime has to be addressed, I think this was the biggest progress.
Right. Right. ALEENA, what are some of the objectives of this legislation, particularly with regard to national security? Because yes, it does deal with terrorism, but what other things does it aim to do?
So the legislation basically mentions about critical infrastructures, and that's where cybersecurity comes in. Critical infrastructures has not been defined in the legislation itself, but generally speaking in the international community as well, it's the critical infrastructures are those sort of structures which are which have some sort of security, national security measures to be adopted. For instance, it could be your banking system, it could be your transportation system, it could be your nuclear system, for instance, but that would be highlighted by each and every state what their critical infrastructures are. So for instance, you know, we keep on talking, right now we're talking about the cyber threats at the national level. So when it comes to the international level, there is a concept of cyber warfare as well. So if for instance we're talking about one particular person or perpetrator attacking these sort of critical infrastructures, which is basically attacking the national security of the state. But what if another state attacks these critical infrastructures? Whether that could cross the threshold of a cyber attack which turns into cyber warfare.
So it's not just limited to individuals, it can be between states also.
It can be between states as well, but that's where when we talk about at the international level, what this piece of legislation is trying to do right now, it is basically dealing with the domestic level issues. But then again, as I said previously as well, the anonymous nature of attacker, it is not necessary that the person who is committing any sort of cyber crime is sitting in Pakistan. He can be sitting anywhere in the world and attacking one of the critical infrastructures, or one of any sort of normal structures which is actually not a critical infrastructure as well. Another thing that needs to be highlighted, that even when they talk about cyber terrorism, it talks about cyber terrorism being attacked on the critical infrastructures, and then that's an issue. Is cyber terrorism just limited to offending the national security, or is it much more than that as well?
Right.
So
ASAD, what is the bill, what does it aim to do as far as international breach of security is concerned? It doesn't address that?
Not really, no. Although there has been some amendments now, and by that I mean very recent. I was in one of these committee meetings, and there were officials talking about it. So now they've changed the implementation of this law to include people who are sitting abroad, for instance. Right. But then it also depends on what kind of mechanisms do we have to actually extradite those people with international law enforcement agencies. And this is one of those important points that we need to make sure that cyber crimes legislation in Pakistan, and not just this particular one, deals with. Because this is now, the new warfare.
But there are limitations, there are technical limitations also from what you're saying. That's what I feel, that there are a lot of technical limitations to what can and cannot be done. And it's not really just about what can be put in the law. It has to be seen what is technically possible.
Absolutely. Technically, I think there are a lot of things which are possible, for instance, but they're not being very effectively dealt with. But yes, you're absolutely right. There is a technical limitation to everything that we talk about as well. And technology, mind you, is literally on a daily basis is now developing. So,
right.
So this is something which should be an ongoing process. But like we were just talking about it in the break, that there are things that you can control, for instance. If somebody has a Twitter account in Pakistan and they're actually recruiting people in Pakistan through that Twitter account for ISIS, or let's just say that this person is sitting outside the country and he's doing it from there, now this has to be a crime, right? But I don't see, maybe it's my fault, but I don't see anywhere in the legislation which mentions something like this to be a cyber terrorism crime. You see what I mean?
But what are, quickly, Yasir, what are some of the amendments that have now come in to deal with some of the issues that were earlier in the previous legislation that were being faced?
Well, the most important amendment that I saw was the fact that the power that was given to the PTA in terms of censoring or taking content intelligence offline, that has been now given to the federal government. This is the most important amendment. I think this is definitely a huge improvement over the situation where you had this autonomous body that was given the power, and now the federal government will exercise it itself.
Right, right. I'm sorry, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Yes, it's a fact that now we have a cybercrime law which we have never had in the past. That itself is a huge achievement. And yes, the civil society may have reservations, but it's also a fact that this law is an evolving subject. It is a borderless medium, and things will keep happening to which we may not always have answers, and we will keep looking for them. Thank you so much for joining me today.